Well, as of this morning's greeting at the door from a few people and their expectations of today's sermon, I can tell you there's one surefire way to know you will not meet people's expectations, and that's to be the straight guy trying to sum up marriage equality in 18 minutes. That won't happen. It's a start and a continuation of that conversation. When I first read Eboo Patel's words this morning that Daryl read to us, it's this story about a deep moment of shame in his life when he realized that standing by in silent support of a friend in a time when he was being mistreated was not support at all. And when I read that story, it made me think of a moment from my high school time, like he described, not with a Jewish friend, but with the first person that I knew who had ever fully come out as a gay man to his community. I'd had a lot of different kinds of friends. I ran in a lot of different crowds, and we knew each other from theater. He wasn't the first person that I knew who was gay or had privately told me that they were gay or lesbian, but he was the first person I knew who was really out to everybody in the school, everybody in the community. It wasn't a private matter about his identity. And I remember at age 15, a couple of moments that reminded me that I was being a very good friend in private to him and a really bad friend in public. Got along really well, and he had really no troubles in our theater relationships with his friends. But I remembered one day when I saw him standing down the hall, and two guys that I knew were saying incredibly mean things to him, all kind of couched in jokes. And I saw him down across a long way away from me in the hall, and I knew exactly what was happening, and I could hear their conversations, and I remember watching him try to kind of play this off as a joke and one-up them with his wit, which he could do. And then when the situation dissolved, I recognized what had happened. I had watched it happen. Minutes must have gone by. I just sat there and watched a person who thought that I was his friend take abuse that I wouldn't consider appropriate for anybody. And I immediately had this sensation of shame and wondering if he had seen me standing at the other end of the hall watching what was happening instead of being with him. It was this distinct moment in my life that stuck with me, in which I knew that in order to be myself, I didn't feel like myself in that moment. I felt like something less than who I was. That in order to be myself, I couldn't stand by and watch things I cared about. I had to move from the sidelines to the center of these kinds of issues, to use an image, from watching the parade to marching in it. And I think that there are a few reasons why we would preach explicitly about such a specific issue in our pulpit, one where politics and religion meet, and they do often in this church. One of the reasons is I think sometimes the things that go without saying bear repeating. That it's easy for us to take our values for granted, and we have a strong tradition of support for full marriage equality in the GLBT community. This is nothing new for us. It's not a big political risk for me to stand and support this in this pulpit. It shouldn't be. But I think sometimes we can take these things for granted, coming back to this place and knowing that we believe something, but not really being sure why we believe something, or at least not being able to explain it to somebody else. And also I think it's because the things that truly matter don't get fixed by saying them or doing them once. You don't tell your friends and family, well, Grandma, I told you 18 years ago I loved you. Isn't that enough for you? A lifetime's worth of subtle and explicit messages about a community being less than others. And that's what we're talking about. A lifetime's worth of messages and language of less than relationships is not fixed by one sermon or one march or one public meeting or one lay leader's statement. It's something we have to do over and over again. This is an inherently religious issue for me, and I think for us, because our ancestors, people who founded this country, our religious ancestors, affirmed that some of the primary ways we experience God, some of the primary ways that we experience the holy, creative forces of life itself come in deep humility, compassionate community, and acts of service to others. And legalized inequality gets in my way of experiencing those things and experiencing my God. I think that it's easy for us to take some of this for granted given how far we've come in a generation. I am assuming that the generation younger than me assumes they will grow up and eventually be in a world, or at least the United States, with marriage equality for GLBT individuals. I almost can't believe that we've come from Stonewall to the Supreme Court in a single generation. Or that somebody like Ellen DeGeneres can debate a presidential candidate on the value of marriage equality on daytime TV and get applause during her show. That is a world away from only a few years ago. I don't know if some of you are on Facebook, but in the last couple of weeks with the Supreme Court debating the Defense of Marriage Act and California's Proposition 8, many people changed their profile pictures to the Human Rights Campaign's equality sign. I think 90% of the 1,000 friends I have on Facebook had this change. It was incredible. A world away from what I think would have been possible even 10 or 15 years ago. A majority of Americans now support full equality and inclusion for the GLBT community when it relates to marriage, and yet the laws aren't. Now, I want us to be people who enter into this dialogue as informed participants from a place of faith. You and I might not think it should matter what the Bible has to say about this in our laws with separation of church and state, but you know as well as I do that many people's positions on this issue are informed by their faith and the Bible, which plays a big part in it. So it's important for us to know what the Bible says and doesn't say about same-sex relationships. So let me tell you this. In the whole corpus of dozens of different books assembled and written over the course of over 1,000 years, collected into something which you now call the Bible, there are about 12 verses that even come close to mentioning same-sex relationships. Half of those that are cited are actually about cultic prostitution or practices in the Greek world that had nothing to do with two people in a committed relationship. Two of the examples that you will hear people mention often are the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah in Paul's writings. If you don't know that story very well, in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the man Lot is camped outside Sodom in a tent. Two angels come to visit him, come into his tent to seek shelter and companionship, and the men of the town of Sodom come to the tent, demand to be welcomed in so that they may forcefully have intercourse with his guests. In this story, Lot says, "Don't do this to them. Take my daughters, they're virgins, and do whatever you want with them, but please, not these two men." This is not a story about a condemnation of homosexuality. This is a story, an ambiguous one that is hard for me to understand, which is about force and domination and an extreme lack of hospitality. And when Jesus mentions this story hundreds of years later, that's the context he mentions it in. People often quote Paul's letters where he says something about homosexuals not entering the kingdom of heaven. That's an English word, and the Bible was not written in English. It's a translation of a Greek word which refers to a male prostitute. Translation isn't talking about people in committed partnerships. We might have 2 or 3 verses left in the entire corpus of what's called the Bible that have anything to say about this, and there are 2,500 2,500 verses about how we should treat the poor. 2,500. Let us wage campaigns as a religious people to fight poverty with the same strength and vehemence that people have waged other issues, huh? Jesus has absolutely nothing to say about this issue. Not a sentence, not a word, not a line. I think to use the Bible in an argument really on our side or anybody else's isn't much good. And I think that to include Jesus, who got in trouble for hanging out with culture and law, said we're not equal, to include him and his tradition in any argument that excludes people based on their identity is biblically unsound and intellectually dishonest, to say the least. We should know what these things say so that we can be partners in this dialogue. I think it's also important for us as people of faith approaching this to know that we're not talking about an abstract debate about the definition of marriage. If it was, this thing would be a lot less powerful. There's nothing abstract about this conversation. When I wrote on Facebook and emailed my LGBT friends, I asked them in the past couple of weeks to share stories with me about when being legally married or not being legally married affected their lives. I did not get one response that was about a definition of marriage or a religious ceremony. Every response I got had to do with getting a loan or visiting someone in the hospital or adopting a child or making a will. Isn't that amazing? Concrete, everyday moments in human lives that are affected by this thing, which is not abstract at all. A member of our congregation, Aaron, wrote back to me and told me that something we often miss is that when the legal differentiation is made between classes of people, we don't even have the right vocabulary to describe our experience to others. She talked about being with a partner for many years and then having that relationship break up. That a person could be in a relationship for 5, 10, 20 or more years, having that relationship dissolve, and then going to their coworkers and having to say, I just had a breakup. That if she had walked in and said, I just got divorced, everyone would know what she meant. They would know the full power of that effect on her human life. They would whisper in the hallways and say, listen, be careful with her. She's going through a rough time. She's just had a divorce, which is different than a breakup. But the legal definition makes it harder, and this I think is more profound than it seems. It literally makes it harder for me to understand her human experience. That's a profound thing. A member of our congregation, Michelle, wrote to me and talked to me about an experience of having her infant daughter in the hospital. Her daughter Willa has 2 moms, Kim and Michelle, members of this congregation, and she wrote to me to tell me about the effect that it had on their ability to both held in the hospital. This is not an abstract debate. This is not a discussion about a piece of paper or a contract between 2 people that straight people are so often repeating. This is not a piece of paper. This is saying, adding literally insult to injury, that when their daughter is sick in the hospital, one of them can't be there. It is precisely because of these concrete, everyday effects on human lives that I believe this is a religious issue for us. Because our religion is an embodied, concrete one. We're not a religion that focuses on the afterlife or the creeds that people recite or what you believe or what you don't believe. We're a religion focused on living well together in this world. And our tradition, which goes back hundreds of years and has a rightful place in the history of this country, some of the founders of this country and the authors of the Declaration were Unitarians and Universalists, affirmed that we experience the holy itself through humility, compassion, and service. And when the law restricts my ability to have humility, compassion, and service, the law is restricting access to my God. Legalized inequality turns humility into humiliation. Think about the effects of a lifetime of hearing a culture and the law say that your relationship is less than somebody else's. Think about the kind of spiritual violence that is done to a society, gay and straight, when anybody's equality is up for debate. In a public forum, somebody's equality at the table of our citizenship is up for debate. I know as well as you do that terms that are related to gay and lesbian in the common language and slang terms often simply mean not as good as something else. And that language, I believe, is sanctioned when the law says that people aren't equal. Legalized inequality restricts my access to God because I find God through community, and it has separated us by definition. Just a couple of weeks ago, I think last week, in fact, in Kansas City, a young man was handcuffed and forcibly removed from the bedside of his partner because they were not legally married in that state, and his partner's family didn't want him there. This is not an abstract debate. That is not compassionate community. In the reading that we had from Jonathan Rausch this morning, he talked about the fact that even as a child, even really before he knew the word gay or that he was unable to imagine a life committed based on love alone. Is that incredible? The imagination of a child was restricted to the point, even before he knew his identity, he could not imagine a life committed based on love alone. This is our country, our state, our city. I have found a path to the holy through service to others, and my tradition holds that up too, and yet legalized inequality restricts people's ability to give all of who they are as a blessing to the world. Don't ask, don't tell, perhaps. Or the difficulty in serving as a public official, as an out person in this country. Or the difficulty that is faced by families in coming to assist with their child's school or be a part of the PTA or any of the regular things that straight people like me take for granted every single day. The ability to serve in congregations that have been people's homes, or 1,000 other things. Bit by bit, we have asked people through legal separation to hide a piece of who they are if they want to serve the public good or even their own families. Our religion has affirmed that we experience the holy through acts of humility, compassion, and service, and this gets in the way. That this is not just an issue that is bad for the people who are on the bad side of the oppression. It's all sides of oppression are bad. Legalized inequality has negative spiritual effects for every single person in the system. My kid grows up in a world in which there is a public debate about people's equality. That stuff seeps in. There's something called implicit association. It means that every time we hear two concepts or words mentioned together, even if we don't know what's happening, our brain begins to relate those things. So even as an ally, even as a supporter or member of the GLBT community, if my son grows up speaking about the fight for the equality of GLBT people, there's the implicit association in his mind that somewhere they're not. It's insidious and dangerous, I believe. Also, if people can't show up in the fullness of who they are and serve the world, I'm worse off for it. I also know that in the system that we have, I have to come out as an ally. Isn't that odd? I have to come out as an ally because the assumption is that we're not. I live in a world in which the people who I share this world with and love assume by law that I'm not for them until I say otherwise. What an amazing disruption of community for me. And also, and I think perhaps the most insidious, is that legalized inequality makes it socially acceptable to do and say nothing. It becomes much easier for a 15-year-old boy to stand in the hallway and watch as his friends are taunted and shamed because the law says they're not equal. It makes it easy to spend our life on the sidelines thinking good thoughts and not moving into the center to stand by people in moments of oppression and justice making. It's bad for everybody. I have to say, I think that there is value in us not ceding the religious ground on this to people who would have another opinion. I don't want people who are looking for a religious home to think that there is no home for them because religion means only one thing. There is value in us being a visible, vocal participant in this dialogue and speaking in the name of our faith. The reality is that most people come to this argument from a faith-based perspective, and we should too. When people ask me, what does your religion say about this? I am comfortable saying our religion is about building the beloved community on earth, expanding the circle of care and compassion as wide as we possibly can. Our tradition, going back hundreds of years, formed by the very founders of this country, affirmed that we experience God through humility, compassion, and service. And each act of legal inequality gets in my way of experiencing my God. My friend in high school did not care, I think, what I thought about equality. I don't think he cared what I thought the definition of marriage was, or what I believed about God, or the holy union of two people. When the chips were down, I think he cared that when things were difficult, somebody was standing with him. And that is what I think we're called to do. Why it's not enough to say, don't we already know that in this congregation? Why it's not enough to march once and never again, or preach one sermon or never again. At the basic foundations of this issue is the question, will we be a part of affirming the humanity of others? Will you be a part of affirming the humanity of all? And I think that this is something that's worth preaching and singing and praying and marching and talking and hugging and shouting and everything else that we can do over and over and over again. About as religious a thing as I can possibly imagine. Perhaps that's enough for today. Amen.